Allahu Akbar.
Human beings, throughout the course of history, try to see how they can relate to one another, me and you. So if we are many, then we have the problem of sociology. How do you relate to one another? And then gradually you begin to find yourself debating as to relationships, conflicts. And then you're going to have the question of power. Who has power and who doesn't have power? And how are you going to allocate power? And that's the whole history of the human beings. Now, when you talk about democracy today, if you're an American, democracy is institutionalized in the form of elections. And you have people who run for office, and they get elected. You can be the mayor of a city, you can be a member of the city council, you can be a senator, and you can go all the way up. What makes democracy in America different from democracy from Italy, France, Germany, and other parts of the world today is because the Americans have developed a way of conducting elections. They have the big time. So America, if you're living in the United States today, you want to understand the metaphors, the analogies, and the similes of election. You have to see in the United States that every 4 years, Americans have a major election. Just like in every society, you try to relate your political relationships to your games. Because human beings are homo ludus in Latin. Men like to play games. So we have democracy as part of our political game, the way we have football, basketball, and baseball in American politics. Now, if you go to England, they play cricket. So all their political metaphors are from cricket. They say you bat your wicket if you're a cricket player. So the English, they use the cricket metaphor. So their democracy is very much explained through sports. They play cricket to explain how you have to be a gentleman. And the only way you can play cricket is you play with a small ball. Whereas in football, you have a bigger one. So you can see how the political process is captured through games. And if you are living in the 21st century and you look around the world, you can see how different groups are trying to develop democratic processes by synchronizing what they do in sports and what they do in politics. For the English, it's cricket. That's the best game. Cricket is the best way you can show yourself as being a gentleman. You accept the rules and you accept the numbering. Now, if you're an American, you play baseball or basketball. Most of the Americans, they use football or baseball metaphor to describe the activities of the politicians. Now, if you're a Canadian, you use hockey. They use the hockey metaphor to explain their politics. So if you talk about democracy and governance, you have to understand how the Canadians, who are Democrats like Americans, but when they look at their political process, they see how you can be a good gentleman on skates. You have ice, and you're able to be very nice and civil to the other guy. You're competing. So you have seen the English, they're English-speaking people, they're democratic, but they have different games to show how they relate to governance and democracy through games. Now, if you look around the world, you can see that there are many human beings who play soccer, but not all of them are democratic. And because you play soccer doesn't mean to say that you are as good as the English who play cricket. Now, some people play cricket, but they're not very democratic. So, I mean, but they become very much isolated as a people who play cricket, but they're not very democratic. So you become a sore thumb. We have fingers. You become the sore thumb. But if you play good world, you'll be just like the other fingers in terms of your metaphor. Now, what is very critical here is if you are looking at governance, what you have to see is how human societies have tried to develop relationship between the ruler and the led. The ruler and the led. You are the leader and the led. So that is how democracy becomes very critical. But you see, but if you are looking at democracy today for Muslims, what you have to recognize is that during the Cold War, the idea of a democracy was to a large extent destroyed. Why? If you are living in the 21st century, you are living in the post-Cold War period. The Cold War ended in 1989, and the Soviet Union collapsed. From 1917 all the way up to 1989, the whole world was caught in a very difficult relationship. You have a new movement in Europe called the Communist movement. And the Communist movement had a different way of understanding human relationships. Because in all human societies, you're going to have the individual, you have the society, and you have the state. So throughout human history, humans have always tried to figure out how can we develop a relationship between the individual, the society, and the state. That's why we have different theories of the state, different theories of society, and different understanding of the individual. So if you live in America today, your understanding of your individuality is very much grounded in the American Constitution. Because if you're an American, you have your Fourth Amendment rights, which talks about your freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and this allows you as a Muslim, you have a right to think as a Muslim. There is no law against you being a Muslim. You can think like a Muslim, so long as you don't step on the psychological toes of other people. You are a Muslim. You can be a Christian, you can be a Jew, you can be Hindu, you can be Buddhist, you can be an atheist. That's one of the reasons why many of the American scholars who look at American society in terms of democracy recognize the fact that in American society, you can believe or not believe in anything. That is one of the reasons why, if you look at the history of the Jewish groups and the Catholic groups, at the founding of the American Republic, 93% of the Americans were English-speaking people. They were from England. They were not British. If you say British, you meaning that they are Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and English. That's what British mean. 93% of the Americans were English. They were the people who came here and they established the Constitution of the United States. So if you talk about democracy and governance in terms of the 21st century, and you are Muslim and you live in America, you have to know that narrative, that history. Then you understand how America came to be where it is today. It was not that easy for all the groups, because American society became a society where other groups who came here were gradually melting. We have a concept here called the melting pot. All the other groups who came from Europe began to assimilate into this society, and gradually they lost their languages. America is the graveyard of foreign languages. Now, what is very interesting here is that if you look at American society in terms of democracy, governance, what you have to recognize is how did the Americans establish a democratic society? If you look at the world today in terms of the 21st century, what you are going to find out is that among human beings, the American experience with regard to democracy and capitalism, I'll come to capitalism very soon, but I just want to focus on democracy so that you understand what democracy is all about in the 21st century for Americans, and in this particular context for the Muslims, Americans. When you look at the world system today, what you are going to find out is that you have 5 major revolutions in the history of the human race over the last 500 years. What are these major revolutions, and how do they deal with capitalism and democracy? The first revolution was the American Revolution. Before the French Revolution in 1776, the founding fathers, 93% of them were English. They were fighting their king. The Americans became the first human beings over the last century. Before their revolution in 76, all human groups, they have kings and queens all over the world. The Americans were the first people who say, we don't want to have king. We want to be a republic. They were not the first people without a republic. They were Romans. They had one. It didn't last long. The Greeks had it. It didn't last long. The Americans became the only human beings 500 years ago who said, we don't want to have a king. We want to have a republic, like the Romans and the Greeks. They had one. Their democracy came out of that experience. When the American founding fathers said, we don't want to have a king, Americans were very weird at that time because all over the world they have kings. So they were very weird. There were people who didn't want to have kings. All over the world they have kings. If you look at the world today, except in the Middle East, you don't have many places where you have kings. So the thing is this: when you look at the American experience in terms of democracy and capitalism, what you have to recognize is to know that narrative. America became the first country where people say, we want to have a republic. We don't want to have a king. They rebelled against the English King George, and they established a country headed by another George, called George Washington. Some wanted him to be king. He said, no, we're going to be a republic. Now, after the American Revolution, the English, who never want to be a republic, the English, from where these people came, the English people, if you are talking about democracy and governance in the 21st century, you can see what happened to the English. The English had their own revolution when King Charles I was killed by the revolutionaries in England. And the English almost had a republic. It failed. Then they went back to monarchy in England. That's one of the reasons why, if you're a Muslim and you're trying to understand the political history of governance and democracy in the world system, you have to go back to that story. You know, the American story, where they became a republic and they developed a democratic process to elect their leaders. And the Americans start to elect their leaders borrowing from the lessons of the Greeks on the one hand and the lessons of the Romans on the other hand. That's why we have governors and senators in this society. You don't have governors and senators in England, no, here. Because Americans are trying to replicate the history of the Romans and the Greeks. And the democratic process is very much grounded on this logic. So today, if you live in the 21st century, you talk about democracy and governance. You have to see how American society is governed in the tradition of the Greeks and the Romans on the other hand, and then at the same time, the legacies they inherited from England. Because after the American Revolution, the Americans were able to create their own democratic system, which exists side by side with what the English started to do. The English they went through a different process of development. That's one of the reasons why today, if you're a Muslim, you can see that in American society, when Americans talk about democracy and governance, you have a Republican type of governance. The concept of republicanism came from the Roman, res publicae, things of the people. That's a Roman concept. The Greeks used to have it at one point in time. But you see, in America today, if you are talking about democracy and governance, you have to see how contemporary American society, American constitutionalism is very much affected by the patterns of organization among the Greeks and the Romans and what they learned from the English before 1776 and what we are still learning from the English because they are developing their system. One fundamental point that is very critical for an audience like this is the fact that in American society, you learn about democracy and you learn about governance at the same time. And this is why the capitalist system entered the picture. The capitalist system entered the picture in the sense that the Americans, when they broke away from the English, they don't want a king. But then they develop certain concepts which are very pronounced in the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the original narrative of Jefferson, it was property. But then they changed the concept. When they were debating that whole declaration, they changed property into pursuit of happiness. That's very critical for us as Muslims living in American society today. We talk about democracy and governance. The individual has rights, and those rights are protected by the Constitution. Then, during the Cold War, one thing that the Muslims encountered, many Muslim countries were colonized by the European powers, they inherited the political system of the European powers, whether they're the French in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, etc., Syria, then Lebanon. Then you have the English in Egypt, in Iraq, and then in Yemen and many other Muslim countries. Then in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. Then you come to Africa, you find the English influence or the French influence. What I'm trying to tell you, when you talk about governance and you talk about democracy in the 21st century, you have to remember now what is beginning to emerge. I told you I have 5 revolutions. You have the American Revolution, republicanism without a king, and a democratic process. The English, who kept their king, but they remained democratic. They moved from the House of Lords, House of Commons, and they have a very different politics from the Americans. They have a system where church and state relationship is very different. The Queen of England is head of state, head of church. We don't have that reality here. So if you're an American Muslim, you live here, you have this different understanding of democracy and governance. The last point I want to develop is the question of property. For Muslims, you talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, if you are a Muslim, you understand this concept, capitalism entered the picture. Property is very important for the American story here. The same thing with the English. But the American system is different from the French system. The French, they became Republican. And they have a whole different understanding. That's why you cannot wear hijab in France, but you can do in America here. You can do that in England. But see, you couldn't do that in Turkey before recent times. Now, what I'm trying to tell you is that if you understand the whole question of democracy and governance on the one hand and the economic system on the other, you can see how your economy could be very much affected by your capitalist system. Because the moment you begin to have your individual, your society, and the state, who control the state? The communists, when they were competing against the capitalists, they said that, well, the bourgeoisie control the system, we have to take power from them so that we can do justice to the working classes. Otherwise, they are being exploited by those people who control the system. That was the old communist narrative. Now, they're finished, they're gone. For anyone who is now looking at governance and democracy today, what you have to take into account is that the Soviet Union became the third force. The English, the Americans, and the whole concept of democracy and governance. Then you have the Soviet Union, where they went a step forward for the fourth relationship. That was France. The French, they were opposed to their king. They got rid of him, like the Americans did. The French, they were hostile to their church. They don't want the church. Americans didn't do that. That's why if you're Muslim, you live in America here, you have your freedom of thought. You can be Muslim or Jew, Christian, whatever you want. But you can even be an atheist. You're still American. Your Americanity is not nullified because you're an atheist. No. During the Cold War, there were people who wanted to do that. They had the House on American Activity because they don't want communists at that time, fighting the communists. But see, you have the American Revolution with regard to democracy, the English Revolution with democracy, the French democracy, which is different from the American and the English. Then the Soviet Union came with their own understanding of democracy, which was the so-called Soviet democracy, which most of us now in retrospect see was a scam, a game. Now, what is happening for you as Muslims is that in addition to the American, the French, the English, the Russian, you have the Iranian Revolution. Deja vu for Muslims. Now you have a situation where you have a movement that took power, and they say they have a democracy in Iran. Now, their democracy I'm looking for analogy, and that is something where I will stop. And I will say to you that now you have those 5 revolutions, and I will stop here in the interest of time. And I'm sure some of you may have questions, and just this is the beginning. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.